So first of all, I will just to make sure we're on the same page. Um, I have an overview on the urban system. So it's maybe some kind of a like an urban metabolism, but it's more. So you can see what comes in, like resources, energy, water, materials, but also goods and services. Also, so the sorry, the videos are a little bit in my way. I don't know how to move that away. Well, no problem. So also the resources, the local resources, urban areas are relying upon like land and groundwater, rivers, and so forth. Also solar, of course. And then what goes on within the system. So of course it's the physical things that go on that there are AC machines, energy is consumed in cars, in factories, and so on. But there is also a lot of other things going on, like healthcare, education, care work, family care, and of course all kinds of consumption of energy and transport services, water, food, and so forth. And the outputs, so the blue ones are, let's say, the desired outputs, like so of the whole system. What we want to achieve in a city is livability, so decent housing, food security, access to services, social economic well-being. But what we want to minimize are the what's here in orange. So all the emissions or all the outputs that are undesirable, like air pollution, greenhouse gases, wastewater, and so forth. So, and what are the environmental challenges of cities? I think in earlier webinars you might have talked about that. So what's very specific for low and middle income countries is that the average, let's say, carbon footprint or emission level per person is higher in cities than in rural areas. So in a country like Germany, it's the other way around. So people in rural areas consume more energy because in particular because they have larger houses and use more transport. But in so-called developing countries in the global south, it's the urban population that consume the bulk of energy. And therefore, they are also responsible for the larger part of greenhouse gases and other emissions. And at the same time, the cities themselves suffer from the consequences of these emissions, directly from air pollution, noise, and so forth, water pollution. But also, cities are directly affected by the impacts of climate change through flooding and other natural disasters, climate-induced natural disasters. And so now we come to the linkage to the social and gender challenges. There is an observation that has been made in many places that with growing urbanization, inequalities among the population tend to increase. So this has been quantified in a number of cities. And when we talk about inequalities, of course, we have several factors. We have gender, but we have also age, education, race, caste, social status, and so forth. And when we link this, so I won't go into all details of, let's say, social inequalities, but when we link this to environmental challenges, the big question is who is responsible for the emission, let's say from cars, from energy consumption, like air conditioning, whatever, and who is most affected by their impacts. So the direct impact, so often in many cities, it has been observed that the people who live in the most polluted areas they contribute less to the pollution. So this is also an effect in the global north, that the cheaper areas to live are often along the big roads, and the people who live there, they don't use cars. It's the people who live in nice, green, clean areas who are producing this pollution. And also related to climate change, so underprivileged, they often live in disaster-prone settlements. So for instance, in Asia, these are often flood-prone areas, while, for instance, in Latin America, these are often areas on steep hills, which can be affected by landslides during heavy rains. And the third question is, who has access to clean energy and safe transport service, water and sanitation infrastructure, and also urban space? So urban space, I think, is also a question of it's very closely linked to environment, and it's also a question of social justice. So who uses how much space, and who lives in dense settlements. And so one other observation is that the growing urbanization, the density of cities tends to decrease, which means cities use disproportionately more space when they grow, but this is not due to the poor people, but due to well, let's say middle class and rich people who use more space, and of course also business and so forth. But the point is, if we just say we want to do policies, poor policies from a gender perspective, this is not enough. So we know, I think you're all aware of the concept of intersectionality. So social categories intersect, and in many cases they aggravate inequalities. And so if you look at the poor, so the most poor, or the most affected by all these effects, are usually the women, because of their role, because of their care duties, family care duties, because they have less resources, because they have more informal jobs, so more insecurity, because of sexual harassment and gender-based violence and so forth. So to address all this, what is the policy framework we have? Of course, the SDGs, and so we're now talking primarily about the linkage between SDG 5 and SDG 11. Of course, also the SDG on climate change and on inequality comes in. So with this work on let's say gender just sustainable cities, we're addressing a number of SDGs. And also a large number of references is in the New Urban Agenda. So New Urban Agenda, is everybody aware of this document? So this came out of the Habitat 3 process, so that is guided by the UN Habitat, the UN Organization for Human Settlements. And the New Urban Agenda is a result of a larger consultation process and negotiating process. It is not binding, therefore we don't hear so much about it. But it's a document governments, not local governments, but national governments have signed, and it's a, let's say, some kind of an agenda for sustainable cities, how to address today sustainable cities, what is the path towards sustainable cities. And in these documents there are many gender references. So in terms of, for instance, for urban planning, for transport planning, it always says it has to be done in a gender responsive way. So they say, what was that? So,
yeah,
so
sorry, can I just remind the other participants to please mute yourself? Thank you. And Gotthilin, just a reminder, you have about 10 minutes left.
Okay, I can't see the time here on my.
No worries. I'll send you a reminder here and there. Thank you.
So I think it's worth looking at that. And then we have the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and Paris Agreement. There's now a lot of progress on gender. We have a gender action plan that is also relevant for national and local governments. And also cities are acknowledged to play a major role to combat climate change and to adapt to climate change impacts. But the linkage of gender and climate change and cities is not so strong. It's not explicitly made, and I must say we're more or less the only ones who have been working since 5 to 10 years on this topic. And usually policymakers, they also always want to know what is it good for? Why do we need gender? It's complicated anyway, and in particular when we talk about climate change, which is, well, the main issue when we talk about energy, the main environmental issue, plus pollution, then policymakers say it's complicated because it's a cross-cutting policy area anyway. Why should we bring in gender? And usually we have two main arguments. One is policies and measures are more effective if you know the target group and if you know about their needs. But I think the most important argument is that gender equality is a fundamental human right. So including equal involvement and gender mainstreaming. And in the end, environmental policy will be fair and more equitable if we can avoid unintended adverse impacts. We learned also that it's not only when we talk about gender and energy and climate change, it's not only about the impacts of climate change, it's also about the impacts of policies, because policies, of course, have differentiated impacts on different populations, and climate policy can have a lot of co-benefits that would contribute to gender equality if properly designed. And so just a couple of issues around energy and transport. So the relevant gender aspects, women are the poorest among the poor. So for instance, poor quality housing, lack of access to infrastructure. And this is all these issues are relevant for urban planning. And I just mentioned here a couple of approaches that would integrate gender. In particular, of course, better housing is more important for women who often stay more at home. I just go quickly through that. So the approaches we suggest for gender responsive measures in urban planning is in particular green and open spaces. This is also when we work with women in a number of countries, for instance, in the Gucci project that was mentioned before. One of the priorities for the local women are always green and open spaces. And also that could be connected to that urban agriculture. What we also need are dense cities, limiting urban sprawl, access to open public spaces and services. This is particularly important for women because there are in many cities there are public spaces that are not really accessible for women. I just go further because we don't have so much time. As for energy, we need to consider that according to traditional gender roles, men and women have different needs in terms of energy, and in particular, cooking energy is a big problem. And there have been thousands or hundreds of projects around clean cookers, which most of them failed. And it's still an issue that is also relevant for cities. So the picture on the left side, this is in a large city in Myanmar, and they still sell charcoal, and you might know it from your own cities that many people still use charcoal with all the problems around that. And so this is a big question, how to replace these energy sources and how to reduce outdoor and indoor pollution. We also need to think about the resilience of energy infrastructure. We need decentralized renewable energy. So on the right side, this is, for instance, a pilot house in South Africa that is fully renewable. It's a small house for a family that would be adequate to replace these kind of small houses in townships. Solar lighting, efficient household appliances, and so forth. And transport is also a very big issue. In particular, in the transport sector, we have the most data and information on gender differences and the gender bias. Because for energy, it's a bit difficult because we cannot look into the household who is responsible for which part of the energy consumption. But for transport, we have in many countries, we have a lot of good data. And they all show, both in the global north and in the global south, that women and men still have different trip patterns and also use different means of transport. So car usage is much higher among men. And I would say in low and middle income countries, it's not only gender, but also class comes in a lot, because middle class woman in the global south, because of safety issues in the cities, she will very often use a car, while a lower class woman cannot afford that and has a problem of so a lot of constraints in mobility. And we know there are, for instance, data from Vietnam that well, once the husband gets a motorbike, the woman switches from walking to bicycle. Once the husband gets a car, the woman switches to motorbike. So she's always, let's say, one has still a different means of transport. And what we need to achieve, and this is particularly important for women, is a massive shift to public transport, and we need safe and affordable and accessible public transport. And I think there are funds around. There is, for instance, the Green Climate Fund. Some transport systems have been already funded in cities, and the Green Climate Fund requires that there is a gender action plan, that the money is spent in a gender sensitive way. So I think this is an excellent chance for cities to get funding if they improve the public transport system. And so the steps we suggest to integrate gender in the policy making is first integrated in the objectives. So not only talk about low carbon and resilient city, but also inclusive, socially and gender just cities. So that should be part of the environmental goals. And then, of course, a major step is improve gender balance and participation of women, but also in terms of the substance of policy, consider gender roles in particular. So in the first step in communication, education, awareness raising activities, and policy making. But at a certain point, it's necessary to follow a systematic approach, including a gender analysis or a gender impact assessment in order to improve individual policies and actions. And of course, gender needs to be included into monitoring and also into the financial cycle. And finally, I think it's always a starting point working on gender and also other inequalities to get to the deeper causes, not only of social inequality, but also of environmental problems, and thereby opening the path for a deeper transformation of societies. Okay, so one example that came out of the Gucci project that was mentioned earlier is, for instance, the Lorong Garden project in Makassar, Indonesia. So the initial planning by the city didn't involve the citizens, and there was a lot of resistance, in particular from the women, and because the this district should have been greened, and the women said, we don't want greenery because we have to fetch more water. So they preferred plastic flowers actually. And then our partners did a gender assessment as part of this project and worked with the women, and in the dialogue opened other ways how to reorganize and redesign this area. And so and now the objective, the outcome is that they will do urban gardening, because then the women will be willing to spend extra work for watering the plants if they have a benefit from it. So it will be a traffic calmed area, and they are developing a vision for a green model district. Another example is the Makoko Hotspot project in Lagos, Nigeria, also where through participation and a lot of educational activities, gender trainings, women were empowered, facilities for income generation, for instance, market stalls or so, were part of the plan, public facilities, knowledge centers, meeting points. But in the next step, as I mentioned before, we need to do a more systematic gender analysis. And so one methodology you might know is around representation, resources and rights, roles and responsibilities. This is a little bit of a simpler approach. So we have chosen a bit more complicated approach, and that is, we call it GAMMA, Gender Assessment and Monitoring of Adaptation and Mitigation. So it's pretty much focused on climate change, but of course it comprises energy and transport, because these are the main factors for climate change. And it has 3 steps. So one step, we're looking at the institutional setting and the policy framework, including processes and for instance, participation procedures. And this is a very good entry point for our partners who work with the cities, with the pilot cities, and so I think also for other practitioners to get into a dialogue with city officials once they do interviews in order to quantify these indicators of Gamma 1. And Gamma 2 is more a screening of the full program of policies and actions of the city in order to find out, are there gaps in terms of gender priorities. So what I said, for instance, one of the priorities is access to safe, affordable, reliable transport. Another priority is access to clean energy. And if these 2 priorities are not part of the city's program, this is a gap and we need to do something about it. And Gamma 3 is about important policies and measures where we look deeper into individual policies, because if, let's say, public transport is enhanced, this is just an option or a potential to contribute to gender equality. But if we really want to combine the goals of environmental sustainability and gender equality, we need to dig deeper and need to ensure that policies are designed and implemented in a gender responsive way.